Mr. President, if I might respond to my colleague from Mississippi and from Indiana, Senator from Mississippi is absolutely right. The proposal that we will vote on is presented by the Democrats today would allow the death tax exemption to go back down to $1 million. That's the pre-2001 level, and apply a 55% tax rate on top of that. Now, just to give you an example of how that might work in a state like mine, I represent South Dakota. The average size farm in my state's a little under 1,400 acres. And if you look at the average, the value per acre of land and multiply it by the size of the average farm, you're talking about an average farm between $2 and $2.5 million in value. So you could be talking about, this is average. I mean, we got a lot of farms that would be impacted in a much more significant way than this, but you're talking about then subjecting about $1.5 million of that farm's value to a 55% tax rate. And 84% of the value of farm assets, according to USDA, is in real estate. So they're land rich but cash poor. So what happens? Well, when the IRS comes calling after someone passes away and says, well, your farm's worth this amount, we're going to assess a 55% tax, they say, we can't pay that. We don't have the cash. Yes, we have it in land. So what do? They sell the land. They sell assets. They sell equipment to pay the IRS. And here we are trying to promote intergenerational transfer of farms and ranches to keep family farming in this country as part of the backbone of our economy. And this is the absolute opposite of what we ought to be encouraging if we want to have policies that encourage family farms and ranches to stay in the family. So having a confiscatory tax like this that would apply a 55% tax to assets above $1 million is going to have a crushing impact on farms and ranches in my country, and I would submit to my colleague from Mississippi as well. Just to put this in perspective, the proposal in the Democrat bill, which would take the exemption back down to $1 million and raise the top rate to 55%, would apply to 24 times the numbers of farms and ranches as does current law. In other words, it increases by 24 times the number of family farms and ranches that would be impacted by the estate tax relative to where we are under current law. And as the senator from Mississippi pointed out, lots of mom and pop businesses, 13 times the number of small businesses would now be subject to the death tax, as is the case with current law. And so, if you look at the impact of this, certainly in farm and ranch country, I see our colleague from Kansas, Senator Moran, is here, who also represents a lot of farmers and ranchers, very much like those in my state of South Dakota. This is profoundly impactful. I mean, this would have a dramatic impact, a completely adverse, be very, very negative impact on farm and ranch company, but I also would argue, as the senator from Mississippi pointed out, on a lot of mom and pop small businesses in this country. And I would say to my colleague, I thank the senator from Indiana for his very astute observations about the impact of these taxes on hardworking men and women in this country. And I would say to my colleague from North Dakota, who's now here, and the senator from Kansas, both of whom represent very rural states, that this is not an issue that is inconsequential. A lot of people think that people who have $1 million of assets are rich, but as I said earlier, in most farm and ranch operations, the value of that, or 80% of the value of that, is in real estate. And so they may be land rich but cash poor. And so when you talk about imposing a tax of this size on hardworking farmers and ranchers in this country, you really are getting at the very heart of, as the senator from Kansas pointed out, their ability to transfer that farm or ranch operation to the next generation. And that's really what's at stake here. And in North Dakota, the senator from North Dakota is here, and the farmland in North Dakota is very similar to that, what we have in South Dakota, except that they have energy. There's, they found oil in a few places in North Dakota, which drives those land values up even higher. We would like to see some of that in South Dakota. But either way, in either the Dakotas or in Kansas, you've seen land values go up the past few years, and it takes a bigger operation to make it work, to survive in modern agriculture. And so these size of these operations, in many cases, exceed by multiples the amount, the $1 million exemption that would be allowed for under the Democrat proposal, and everything above that, as has been said, would be taxed at 55%, which would be absolutely disastrous for American agriculture today. And that's on top of the other taxes. This proposal also raises taxes on about 1 million small businesses who employ about 25% of the American workforce. It raises taxes on capital gains and dividends, and then it puts this death tax back into place with a $1 million exemption. As I said earlier, if you look at the number of people who would be subject to and covered by the death tax today, this proposal would increase those people subject to whom the death tax would apply 24 times, a 2,400% increase in the number of people who would be subject to the death tax, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. That's the group that studies these issues here and that looks at the impacts of tax policy. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, 24 times more farmers and ranchers would be subject to the death tax than are subject to it today, and 13 times more small businesses. That's the scale of the proposal that the Democrats have put forward. And so I would say to my colleague from North Dakota, my neighbor, that I assume as he talks to farmers and ranchers in his state, he gets the same sort of feedback that I do in visiting with people in South Dakota, and that is they are very, very concerned about what would be a huge tax increase, so to speak, when someone passes on and tries to pass that operation on to the next generation. I appreciate the remarks of our colleague from North Dakota who understands this issue very well, representing a state that is composed largely of family farms and ranches and small businesses. It's similar to my state of South Dakota, similar to Senator Moran's state in Kansas. We share not only a lot of commonalities in terms of how we make our living, but just in the kind of people, the quality, the hardworking, the backbone, as you said, of our country. And there's a work ethic in the land out in people who are involved in agriculture that really is, you hope gets rewarded. And one of the ways that gets rewarded is when somebody works very, very hard all their life, and that's really true in agriculture. There are very few jobs in agriculture that are easy. It is a hard way to make a living. The men and women who are involved in production agriculture have certainly, in my view, among the best work ethics in the country, and you want to see that hard work rewarded. And one of the ways that you hope that it gets rewarded is when it comes time, when you pass on, to be able to allow that operation to be handed off to the next generation so they too can benefit from that hard work and build that enterprise, that operation, and grow the family farm in a way that is good for our economy generally, and certainly good for the economy in places like North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas. And that's why a proposal like this is so devastating, because you are subjecting, as I said, 24 times more farms and ranches in this country to the death tax than are currently exposed to it under current law. And so this is a dramatic increase in the number of folks who would be impacted by the death tax. Obviously, a significant increase in the amount that people were going to be forced to pay when the time comes. And we, I think, at a time when we are facing unemployment now for 41 months, consecutive months, over 8%, 23 million Americans either unemployed or underemployed. Some people, 5.4 million Americans who've been unemployed for a long period of time. The one thing we don't need in the middle of this kind of an economy is a big fat tax increase. And that's what the Democrat proposal does, not just on the estate tax, but also the marginal income tax rates going up on small businesses on January 1st. There will be almost 1 million businesses who are impacted by higher rates, who I should say, employ 25% of the workforce in this country, as well as increase in taxes on investment, on capital gains and dividends. So a big fat tax increase in the middle of a very fragile economy is the exact wrong prescription. And I would hope, as the senator from North Dakota suggested, that our colleagues on both sides will support the alternative that we will put forward, which will extend the rates for all Americans so that not any American is faced with higher taxes come January 1 of this year. I think it would be devastating for our economy to do that, certainly be devastating to the family farms and ranches in places like the Midwest. And I know my colleague from Kansas understands very well, because he represents the same kind of people that we do in the Dakotas. They're hardworking. All they want to know is that they have an opportunity to be able to benefit from that hard work, hopefully pass it on to the next generation when the time comes. The senator from Kansas, I too look forward to working with him on fundamental tax reform, because that is at the essence, that is really what we need to do to get the economy turned around. I think you would see tremendous economic growth. I think you would see our economy unleashed if we would reform our tax code in a way that broadens the tax base, lowers the rates. The senator from Kansas talked about the fair tax. That's certainly another proposal out there that many people support. But in any event, we do need a fundamental tax reform. And it'd be nice if when we do that, we do away with the death tax completely. But that being said, what's being proposed here today, as we've all pointed out, is something that in many cases, in places like Kansas and South Dakota, and our colleague from Wyoming, Senator Barrasso, is now here, who represents a rural state, a state where you've got a lot of folks with big expanses of land, is there are many people in agriculture who are land rich and cash poor. Senator from Kansas pointed out, when you have an operation that exceeds that $1 million threshold that's being proposed in the Democrat tax plan, and then everything above that in terms of the value of your assets is taxed at that top marginal rate of 55%, then you are, in many cases, having to sell pieces of your operation in order to pay the IRS, or worse yet, going to the bank to borrow money, in which case you may not be able to repay it. But this creates all kinds of problems for people who are involved day-to-day in production agriculture when it comes to keeping that operation in the family. And so I appreciate the senators from Kansas' astute observations and his insights based upon his experience with the people that he represents. And I too look forward to the day when we are debating fundamental tax reform. But until that comes, we shouldn't be raising taxes. We shouldn't be raising taxes in this type of an economy where we've got as many people unemployed as we do, where we've got sluggish economic growth, and we certainly shouldn't be punishing family farmers, ranchers, and small business people with this, what is a punitive, just a punitive death tax proposal coming out of the Democrats in the plan that we're about to vote on at 4 o'clock. And I would yield to our colleague from Wyoming, who is here and again represents a state much like mine and much like the senator from Kansas, who has a lot of people who would be impacted by this draconian tax.